A while ago, Bering did this debate with a lady called the Ranting Feminist. In said debate, Bering tried to rationally explain certain things about reality to her, because apparently he's punishing himself for some dark deeds done in his past, but I digress now. One of the things that I've mentioned before, mostly in passing while discussing other matters, is that the more supposedly moderate and less obviously insane feminists are completely incapable of acting to curtail the more insane elements, and that this is an inherent part of the nature of all ideologies that rely on faith-based or non-evidence-based foundations for their ideology. I mentioned this briefly while I was talking in my video previously about why the moderates are just as responsible for the depredations of feminism, or even more so, as the radicals are. But I don't think I took the time to fully explain the reasoning and the rationale. So, what does this have to do with Bering and Ranting Feminist? Well, I want you to listen to a portion of their conversation here.
Most of the disagreeing that happens in feminist movement is not as obvious in your face on YouTube. It's more on other platforms you tend to see it more strongly. And also the disagreements between feminists usually aren't what anti-feminists are interested in. Anti-feminists seem to crave this kind of wrecked bullshit and this whole, animosity. They seem to like that, and we just aren't really doing that as much.
So what are you saying, that you simply agree with each other to give anti-feminists what they want?
Well, no, it's more because if I disagree publicly with another feminist, then I know exactly what response I'm going to get. I'm going to get a bunch of anti-feminists flooding my channel with, "Oh, I wish more feminists were like you. You're so good. You speak rationally because you disagree with this feminist. You should make more videos disagreeing with feminists. Disagree with more feminists. Disagree with more feminists." And at what point
disagree
do I
with
just
anyone
become...
that should be disagreed with? Disagree with anyone that's wrong. Simple.
I mean, that's what you're saying, but I feel like I don't want to end up selling...
So here you have Ranting Feminist outright stating that she will not and cannot argue against the other feminists because she does not want to be seen as arguing against feminism. I was watching this debate with a friend of mine, and he expressed his confusion to me that a person could think like that as it was something beyond his understanding. So, in the interest of helping him out, I thought I would take the time now to finally give it a full explanation as to why feminists, or anyone who follows a religious mindset, can never truly argue with the others on their side. Okay, let's begin. Now, if you look to the circle here, this circle represents the core tenets and premises of your basic religious ideology. The things that are considered true via tautology that are drawn upon to provide the conclusions that the adherents of the ideology follow. Now, in the case of most religions, you have the scriptural interpretation, church tradition, and faith. Or in the case of feminism, you have things like women's experiences, presuppositional dogma, and feminist literature/philosophy. Now, the thing that you'll notice about all these things is that they are effectively subjective. None of these things hold the potential for any objective truths to be discovered. Essentially, they justify anything and everything as long as you hold to the framework built off of these premises. This is, of course, intentional as far as the ideology is concerned. As long as the ideological framework justifies everything, they can never be proven wrong, and indeed, anyone can provide an easy license to do whatever they wish to do, or to condemn whatever they want. The only limitation is their ability to twist the malleable framework into the needed shape. The two primary downsides to this, however, are that by proving everything, the framework essentially proves nothing, and most relevant to this discussion, it provides no means of changing or successfully critiquing the ideological framework from within the framework itself. Now, let's add some adherents of the ideology into the mix. Let's take this religious person. We'll call him Bob. Bob believes that his magic book and cosmic sky daddy that he worships want him to love his neighbors, give to the poor, and be kind and respectful towards his fellow man. When asked, he justifies this by quoting Matthew 2:14 of the Bible and his interpretations of it, the words of his pastor, and what he has learned through prayer and listening to his God. Now let's take a second such person. We'll call her Alice. Alice believes that the cosmic sky daddy and the words of her magic book tell her to help rid the world of homosexuality because it is an abomination, that baby boys should have their genitals mutilated, and that everyone should follow her God and her moral code, or they will burn in hell for all of eternity. When asked, she justifies this by quoting Matthew 2:18 of the Bible and her interpretations of it, the words of her pastor, and what she has learned through prayer and listening to her God. Now, as you can see, both Bob and Alice draw upon the exact same sources in order to provide evidence of their positions. However, from these similar sources, they are drawing completely different conclusions, and both sets of conclusions are largely incompatible with one another. Now, Bob, being a more love all people type of guy, will inevitably think that Alice is making all of their group look bad with her wrong beliefs that are not really what the religion says is true. Meanwhile, Alice thinks that Bob is being lenient towards evil and not following what the religion says is true and allowing evil and immorality to flourish. Unless Bob and Alice are willing to admit that their faith is entirely created in their own minds and is essentially just stuff that they are making up, both these conclusions which derive from these premises cannot be true. So, how does this get resolved? Generally, Bob says to Alice that the magic book and Sky Daddy are against what she is doing, and to prove this he quotes the magic book and his faith. To which Alice will generally respond that her conclusion is the correct one by quoting the magic book and her faith. Thus, the exact same evidence is being used to support both conclusions, as well as the exact same sources being referenced. This is a phenomenon that you will see without fail if you watch religious debates or read religious op-eds where one religious person criticizes the beliefs of another. The arguments will inevitably boil down to your interpretation is wrong, my interpretation is the correct one, because my faith says so, while the other side will be replying vice versa. As I said, the tautologies that are used as the basis for the ideology are universally applicable. So we have this situation between Bob and Alice, where any argument or source of evidence that Bob uses to argue against Alice's position can equally be used by Alice against Bob's position. And conversely, any defense Bob makes of his position can also be used by Alice to defend her position. Any attempt to argue against the premises that the other side is using as a basis for their conclusions will inevitably undermine your own position, as they are the exact same type of premises and evidence. You cannot, for instance, question the validity of Scripture if you yourself are relying on that Scripture to prop up your own case. And if saying that one has faith is not a sufficient defense to their beliefs and actions, then it is not a sufficient defense for oneself. So, we need to resolve this conflict between different versions of the ideology. But the ideology itself cannot be used to help us determine which side is correct. So what do? Well, sometimes we get schisms in the faith, where the two sides part ways and no longer consider themselves a part of the same ideological structure. But this rarely actually solves the conflict itself. Typically, it just lessens the capability of the two groups bumping into each other, and lessens the overall power of the groups themselves, as now they have fewer human resources to put towards their goals. In non-secular societies, this is usually one of the precursors to a potential religious war or religious genocide. Having little other method of dealing with the other group, eventually one group must defeat or destroy the other, either through violence or some form of coercion or intimidation to make the other group acquiesce. In a secular society where no religious group holds any real power or force beyond what its adherents allow it to exert over them personally, you will rarely get any violence, as it would not be tolerated by the society. In secular societies, you'll get more verbal conflicts and shaming between the groups, since neither really has the social or political power to challenge each other directly. And there are, of course, some others that will be content to just sit there in their own space and do their own thing, and not bother anyone, but they tend to also not achieve much as far as pushing their beliefs and goals in society. But, I'm getting a bit far afield here. So, since Bob and Alice are relying upon the same evidence and the same premises to support both of their conclusions, the only way to argue that one is right and one is wrong is by arguing against the evidence or those underlying premises, which obviously cannot be done because the evidence and premises are the same, only the conclusions differ. So if Bob argues that Alice's position cannot be supported by faith, as faith is not a valid means of determining truth, he must also accept this about his own faith-based position, at least if he is to have any intellectual and ideological consistency. This even applies to entirely different faith-based beliefs as well. A Christian defending his faith-based conclusions will also defend the will also defend the faith of Muslims, even if he personally objects to Islam and its own conclusions. Blasphemy laws are a good example of this. Even in countries where there is a predominantly Christian religious following, those laws are passed to apply to all faiths, because the premise itself can only be defended universally. Once you say that one group's faith is invalid, it bites you inevitably in the ass, and brings up the question of why your own isn't. To give a further example, take the massive Muslim outrage over the Danish cartoons of Muhammad, quite some more than a few years ago. When the Muslims were screaming in rage at the mocking of their prophet and preaching death to the infidels, what did the Catholic Church speak up to condemn? It wasn't the violence that they condemned, it was the cartoons. Because to allow the cartoons would be to give license to the mockery of their own beliefs and icons, which are equally as mockable. This, of course, is where the cognitive dissonance starts to ramp up, but that's another subject for another time. So, to relate this back to the point about feminism, as mentioned at the beginning, feminism has its own set of premises and tautologies that it is built upon. Women's ways of knowing / experiences, society, i.e. men, has always conspired to oppress women, feels over reals, feminist literature, blah blah blah. Like religion, these are neither objective nor are they easily quantifiable things. They can also be used to justify any position one wants, and in so doing, will justify none of them. So let's go back to Bob and Alice for a moment. Bob believes that we live in an inherently unequal society, in which women have been historically disadvantaged. He points to the writings of various feminists who talk about sexism in wages and government representation, toxic masculinity, and how unsafe women are afraid to walk the streets at night because they feel unsafe and are in constant fear of rape or assault. He concludes that men and women need to come together and form a better and more tolerant society, that both sexes need to cooperate and remove gender roles so that everyone is free to be who they are. Alice, meanwhile, believes that we live in an inherently unequal society in which women have been historically disadvantaged. She points to the writings of various feminists who talk about sexism in wages and government representation, toxic masculinity, and how unsafe women are afraid to walk the streets at night because they feel unsafe and are worried about rape and blah blah blah. She concludes that men are naturally horrible psychopaths conditioned by society to harm women and keep them in servitude. After all, how else can you explain why men would create a society that would be so horrible to women? Men are taught by society, which is controlled by them, to behave in toxic ways and to rape and harm women, to use the threat of rape and sexual violence to keep them fearful and subjugated, so clearly the only way to create an equal or fair society is to remove men from any power or authority. Possibly herd them into camps where they can be watched over by women, as the Julie Bindels of feminism suggest. Both conclusions are perfectly in line with the initial premises of feminism, and can be justified with the same evidence. And, just as with the religious example that we started with, feminist Bob cannot effectively argue against feminist Alice without attacking the underlying premises of the ideology, which again will equally apply to him. If both Bob and Alice each use patriarchy, for instance, as a defense or support for their conclusions, then patriarchy is what must be examined and argued for or against in order to decide which conclusion, if any, is best, and neither can do that without risking their own position. So that, in a very long and circuitous explanation, is why the Ranting Feminist will not and cannot question the other feminist in her clique openly bearing. I hope that made sense to you all. I know I can get a little airy and rambly at times. Anyways, I'm about talked out for today. I'll try to do something more entertaining next time. Like and subscribe if you would like, or tell me if you want to see more of this kind of explaining meta-type thinky stuff, or you want to see more of something else. Later.